May 1945, late afternoon, somewhere on the edge of a shattered German town in the American zone. The air still carries the chalky bite of pulverized brick. In a school courtyard, glass crunches underfoot. A bell that once ordered children into lines hangs silent and crooked, its rope cut or burned away. Inside, the corridors smell of wet plaster, coal dust, and old paper that has survived fire by accident rather than mercy. And in a room where maps have been torn down and slogans scraped off walls, a new cargo arrives in plain crates. Books, thick, clean, unscarred by smoke, stamped and catalogued, their pages white in a country where everything seems gray. A German woman steps through the doorway, not a soldier and not a child, one of the many who have been made into caretakers of ruins. Perhaps she is a teacher newly screened, perhaps a librarian trying to resurrect a collection that has been purged twice, first by ideology, then by war. She does not touch the crates at first. She watches the Americans work, uniforms moving with practiced rhythm, clipboards, lists, dates. The crates open, and the scent rises, ink, glue, fresh cloth binding, the quiet confidence of mass printing. She has lived through years in which paper grew thin and cheap, in which reading narrowed to what was approved, in which libraries became instruments. Now the shelves begin to fill again, and what overwhelms her is not only the quantity. It is the assumption behind the quantity, the idea that a school should have this much to choose from, that a child should be surrounded by options, that knowledge should not be rationed like bread. This moment matters because the defeat of Nazi Germany was not only a military collapse. It was a collapse of a worldview that had sought to monopolize truth. When the Allied armies crossed the Rhine and the Reich fell, the physical wreckage was obvious. Bridges broken, rail lines twisted, cities hollowed by firestorms. But the occupation confronted another kind of ruin. The moral and intellectual landscape shaped by 12 years of controlled speech, controlled press, controlled classrooms, controlled libraries. The Americans, under the Office of Military Government, United States, OMGUS, understood that if Germany were to be rebuilt into something that could live without marching orders, the rebuilding could not end at factories and food distribution. It had to reach into the institutions that formed minds. In the planning documents and early directives, information and education were treated as strategic terrain. Allied authorities framed the mission in blunt terms. Information services, including books, would be controlled to further military and political objectives. In the long term, Nazism and militarism were to be eliminated from influence, and German information services would be rebuilt, purged, and supervised until trustworthy German leadership could assume responsibility. The language is clinical, almost cold, but behind it is a profound recognition. The war had been fought with weapons, but the regime had been sustained with stories, textbooks, children's readers, newspapers, and the steady drumbeat of a single permissible interpretation of the world. 4 German women, who in 1945 formed a vast share of the visible civilian workforce amid the absence and death of men, this collision between old control and new abundance often arrived in places like schools, relief centers, and reopened cultural institutions. The Nazi state had mobilized women rhetorically as bearers of the nation and managers of sacrifice, but in practice it had also narrowed the space in which they could think freely, teach freely, or read freely. War then narrowed it further. Bombed buildings, lost collections, paper shortages, disrupted schooling, and the daily exhaustion of survival. The American occupation brought a paradox. The occupier arrived with authority backed by force, yet proclaimed that its long-term aim was to teach the habits of self-government and the credibility of straight news, a deliberate contrast to propaganda. The emotional contrast, the heart of why your title lands with such quiet force, lies in what German civilians, including women working in education, expected from Americans, versus what they sometimes encountered in the specific realm of books and school libraries. Many expected punishment, humiliation, the stripping away of German culture as revenge. They expected hunger first, because hunger was everywhere, and then, if anything, ideology delivered like another ration. blunt sermons, forced confession, slogans replacing slogans. They expected the victors to behave like victors often had in Europe, taking, requisitioning, directing, commanding. What some experienced, instead, was something stranger, a flood of information so large it was difficult to absorb. An American re-education article from March 1946 described precisely this problem, not in triumph, but as a practical obstacle. Germans, it said, had been cut off from the world since 1933, and now faced an inability to assimilate the flood of news which is suddenly inundating them. That observation was not limited to newspapers and radio. It captured the larger sensation of post-war contact with American informational abundance. Too many facts, too many perspectives, too many printed pages to fit into the mental habits formed under a system that insisted there was only one permissible line. Even in the same American account, the occupation's educators described gathering Nazi picture books liberally sprinkled with soldiers, tanks, U-boats, bombers, and the Führer's face, removing laudatory references to Nazism and militarism from elementary textbooks, and promising that honest descriptions would someday appear in new history volumes. The intent was not merely to remove poison, but to replace a landscape of militarized childhood with something quieter, more civilian, more open-ended. And yet the Americans themselves understood the contradiction, teaching democracy through control. A later historical reflection on occupation book policy describes the discomfort and backlash when the Allies ordered the confiscation of Nazi and militarist literature and faced accusations that the policy resembled Nazi book burnings in reverse, an early warning that democratic ends pursued through coercive means could corrode the moral authority of the project. The question was posed openly in the press. Was this different in principle from Nazi book burnings? The occupation had to live inside that tension. So where do American school libraries enter with such symbolic power? Because a school library is the opposite of a single voice. It is not a sermon. It is not a decree. It is a room designed for choice, quiet, plural, unspectacular choice. It is a physical argument that a child's mind should be allowed to wander without permission. In the German experience of the 1930s and early 1940s, books had been weapons of formation, selected, purified, made to march in step. In wartime scarcity, books also became objects of desperation, traded, hoarded, burned for heat, lost in evacuations. By 1945, many German school buildings were damaged or destroyed. Educational continuity was broken. Teachers were missing, compromised, or discredited. The occupation's education officers described tremendous obstacles in opening schools, finding textbooks, teachers, and denazifying the system. Even their optimism was cautious, stretched over years and decades rather than weeks. Now imagine the psychological shock when Americans, not yet trusted, often resented, sometimes feared, put into those damaged buildings a material display of stability. Shelves that can be filled, bindings that do not crumble, multiple copies of the same title, paper thick enough to withstand children's hands, catalogs, systems, the idea that a library can be planned and resupplied as a normal civic function. For many German women in education, especially those tasked with rebuilding classrooms, this would have carried a private sting. Not only they have so much, but they assume children deserve so much. It was not merely abundance of paper. It was abundance of permission. And so, if we choose a single recurring symbol to represent American abundance or democracy, the object that returns like a refrain, quietly transforming what the eye sees, we choose the library card. Not a weapon. Not a flag. A small rectangle of stiff paper, printed cleanly, with lines for a name and a date. It is humble, almost laughably modest compared to the grand banners of the Reich. But it contains a radical idea. The state is not giving you one approved text, it is granting you access to many and trusting you to return them. It is a contract built on faith in ordinary behavior. It is democracy reduced to stationary. In the American occupation narrative itself, There is an awareness of how Germans would react to anything filtered through American hands. The same 1946 account notes that Germans tended to suspect American-controlled news as propaganda, even when American supervisors labored to keep it factual. That suspicion was a residue of living under propaganda. Once a population has been lied to by its own institutions, it learns to doubt all institutions. In that sense, an American school library was not automatically a gift. To some, it could appear as another instrument of influence, only softer, quieter, wrapped in paper instead of steel. But the occupation's own strategic manuals insisted on something that helps explain why libraries were chosen as a tool. Allied information services were meant to demonstrate an objective news and information service, to teach Germans to trust straight news, in contrast to Nazi propaganda. Trust cannot be commanded into existence. It can only be practiced into being, repeated day after day, in small encounters where the world does not rearrange itself to serve the regime's ego. A library is one of those encounters. There is also the deeper transformation. How exposure to abundance changes ideology not through argument, but through atmosphere. A person can reject a lecture and still be changed by a room. The Nazi state promised greatness and delivered ration cards, grief telegrams, and rubble. It promised belonging and delivered conformity enforced by fear. It promised heroic destiny and delivered mass graves across Europe. By 1945, the ideological glamour was gone, replaced by the raw arithmetic of catastrophe. And yet, as the American correspondent noted in 1946, many Germans, especially younger ones, including veterans, were still resistant to the concepts of war guilt and collective responsibility. Re-education among adults, the article suggested, had not yet been markedly successful. This is where the school library becomes more than a library. It becomes time. Because children can be shaped by what adults refuse to admit. Occupation educators believed that if schools could run for long enough without militarist propaganda, at least one generation might reach adulthood without encountering that indoctrination in the classroom. The same account speaks of hopes that in 10 years of press, magazines, radio, and education explaining how democracy works, the German mind could be diverted from fascism and militarism toward representative government and peaceful ideals. The timeline was long because the wound was deep. A German woman standing before newly stocked shelves might not speak these theories aloud. She would not need to. She would see the change in her hands. She would take the library card, this small democratic artifact, and understand that it assumes a future in which the child returns. It assumes stability. It assumes that tomorrow will come and that a civic system will still exist to receive what was borrowed. In 1945 Germany, that assumption alone could feel like an accusation against the past decade, against every promise of the regime that ended in ash. Yet the transformation is not clean, and the occupation record admits it. American planners struggled with the optics and ethics of removing books. Critics compared Allied confiscations to the very practices the Allies claimed to oppose. The intellectual reconstruction of Germany required censorship and supervision in its early phase, even as it aimed toward freedom. The occupation had to balance the immediate need to prevent Nazi remnants from using print again with the long-term need to create a society that could not be commanded by printed lies. In that tension, the school library served as a bridge between two eras of reading. One era in which books were chosen for you. Another era in which you were expected to choose and to live with the responsibility of choice. And women, in countless school buildings and temporary classrooms, were often the human hinge between those eras. They cleaned rooms, patched roofs, found chalk, registered children, and, quietly, became the first custodians of a new informational environment. If a library was rebuilt, it would be women who kept it open when winter came and the coal ran short. It would be women who decided which children could borrow first when coats were thin and feet were wet. It would be women who watched what happened when a child, raised under slogans, encountered a shelf that did not shout. The library card returns again and again in this story because it is the opposite of the total state's relationship to the individual. The total state owns you. The library card recognizes you. It writes your name not as a number in a file, but as a borrower, someone presumed capable of caring for borrowed property, someone presumed capable of reading and returning, someone presumed capable of participating in a small civic ritual without force. And after the Third Reich, that presumption could feel almost unbearable in its simplicity. By late 1945 and into 1946, American occupation policy framed the control and rebuilding of information services as a phased process. First Prohibition, then Allied-run services, then gradual licensing of German-run services under supervision. The manual's language is explicit. The interval after Prohibition was to emphasize the destruction of the Nazi machine and give time for reconnaissance necessary for the licensing of German information services. A school library in the American zone existed inside that phased plan. Supervised reopening, denazified staff, removal of militarist texts, replacement with new materials. It was part of an architecture intended to make the end of the old order visible in daily life, not just in the absence of uniforms on the street, but in the absence of uniforms in children's books. And so we return to the sensory room in May 1945. Plaster dust, broken windows taped over, a stove that may or may not have fuel. The American crates sit open. Titles stack on tables. A ledger appears. A stamp pad. A handful of library cards. The German woman takes one between her fingers. The paper is stiff and clean. It does not crumble. It does not smell like damp cellars or smoke. It smells like something manufactured in peace. She reads the printed lines. Name. Class. Date. Return. Return. 4 years, the Reich's promises were always forward, always destiny, always conquest, always tomorrow as a battlefield. The library card is different. It imagines tomorrow as a quiet appointment with responsibility. In time, this is how ideology changes, not always through denunciations or tribunals, but through repeated exposure to a world that contradicts the old assumptions. A child who can borrow freely begins to think in categories the total state cannot tolerate: preference, curiosity, private judgment, dissenting interpretation. The occupation understood this even as it struggled with the contradictions of its own authority. And yet there is one final truth, the one that closes the story with the weight of epilogue rather than policy. Abundance is not only food and fuel. It is alternatives. In a dictatorship, scarcity is engineered not only in material goods but in ideas. A population can survive on little bread, but it cannot remain free on one book. When the American crates opened in ruined German schools, what spilled out was not merely paper. It was the physical proof that a society can afford to let its children wonder. In the end, the library card, small, quiet, easy to lose, becomes the recurring symbol because it carries the most fragile promise, that freedom is a habit practiced in ordinary rooms. Not only in parliaments and elections, but in a child's hand reaching for a shelf, choosing a book without permission, and walking home under a sky that no longer demands applause. A nation does not leave tyranny all at once. It leaves it the way a person leaves a burning house. First the desperate breath of escape, then the slow realization of what was endured, then the long, uncertain rebuilding of trust. Some Germans resisted, some doubted, some called every American effort propaganda, because they had been trained to see manipulation in every official voice. But the shelves filled anyway. The cards were stamped anyway. The borrowed books returned anyway, some late, some damaged, some never returned at all, because human beings remain human beings under any flag. And still the system persisted, because democracy is not a claim of purity. It is a structure built to survive ordinary flaws. That is the larger truth your title points toward, that the victors did not only occupy territory. They introduced an atmosphere, one in which abundance could be measured not just in calories or coal, but in pages, in options, in the quiet right to look away from the official story and choose another. If you want, I can now write the full 5,000 to 6,000 word continuous WW2 Tales style script in this exact tone, using the library card as the recurring symbol throughout, and weaving in the same primary anchors we pulled here. HAEF/Information Control Manual. The 1946 Re-Education article. The documented debate over book confiscation and its resemblance to book burning.